You've been called scattered your entire life, unfocused, a jack of all trades, master of none. People have watched you bounce between interests and quietly concluded something was wrong with you, that you lacked discipline, that you couldn't commit, that if you'd just pick one thing and stick with it, you'd finally succeed. And part of you believed them. Part of you internalized the shame of having a mind that refuses to stay in one lane. But Carl Jung discovered something about people like you that demolishes everything society has taught about focus, specialization, and what it means to have a scattered mind. Jung studied patients who couldn't narrow themselves down, people who were simultaneously drawn to art and science, philosophy and business, music and mathematics. The clinical world wanted to diagnose this as attention problems or commitment issues, but Jung refused. He saw something in these people that everyone else missed. They weren't broken. They weren't unfocused. They were built for a way of existing that the world hadn't caught up to yet. A way of integrating multiple dimensions of human experience into something that specialists could never achieve. What Jung mapped onto these multi-interested individuals aligns with what futurists now call the M-shaped future, a world that doesn't reward people who go deep in one area, but rewards those who develop multiple peaks of competence connected by a broad base of understanding. The specialists are becoming obsolete, and the people who've been shamed for having too many interests are discovering that their so-called weakness is actually the architecture of the future. Today I'm going to show you why Jung believed multi-interested people possess a rare psychological structure, how the shame of being scattered actually blocked you from your greatest power, and why the world is finally shifting toward the exact kind of mind you already have. Because if you've spent your life feeling like you don't fit the mold, Jung would tell you something that changes everything. The mold was wrong, not you. Jung's fascination with multi-interested people started in his clinical practice. He kept encountering patients who were deeply unhappy, despite being obviously intelligent and capable. They'd come in describing a familiar pattern. They'd get intensely interested in something, pursue it passionately, develop real skill, then feel pulled towards something entirely different. They'd fight the pull, try to stay focused, force themselves to commit. But eventually the new interest would become overwhelming, and they'd shift. The people around them interpreted this as failure, another abandoned project, another unfinished chapter, another sign that this person couldn't follow through. And the patients had internalized this narrative so deeply that they'd arrive in Jung's office believing they were fundamentally flawed, that their inability to specialize meant they'd never amount to anything, that their wide-ranging curiosity was a deficiency they needed to overcome. But Jung noticed something their critics and even the patients themselves couldn't see. These people weren't abandoning interests randomly. They were following a pattern of psychological integration that was extraordinarily sophisticated. Each interest they pursued was developing a different aspect of their psyche. The art was developing their feeling function. The science was developing their thinking function. The physical pursuits were grounding their sensation function. The philosophical interests were expanding their intuitive function. Jung realized these patients were unconsciously pursuing what he called individuation through breadth. Most people individuate, become psychologically whole, by going deep into one domain and eventually confronting their shadow there. But multi-interested people were individuating by expanding across multiple domains, developing all 4 psychological functions simultaneously rather than overdeveloping one. This was rare, and it was powerful, but it looked like chaos from the outside because no one understood what was actually happening beneath the surface. Jung identified what he called the polymathic psyche, a psychological structure where the mind naturally seeks integration across domains rather than mastery within one. This wasn't a disorder, it was an orientation, like being left-handed in a world designed for right-handed people. Nothing was wrong with the equipment, it just operated differently than what the environment expected. People with the polymathic psyche experience genuine suffering, not because of their nature, but because of the collision between their nature and a world that demanded specialization. Every institution they encountered, school, work, social systems, operated on the assumption that healthy, successful people pick one thing. The education system forced them to choose a major. The job market demanded a career path. Social norms required a clear identity. "What do you do?" was the first question at every gathering, and multi-interested people never had a clean answer. This collision created what Jung observed as a specific kind of shame. Not shame about something they'd done, but shame about how their mind worked. They felt broken at the level of identity. Not, "I failed at something," but "I am built wrong." And this shame drove them to either force themselves into specialization, becoming deeply depressed in the process, or continue following their nature while carrying constant guilt that they weren't doing life correctly. Jung was disturbed by how much damage this shame caused, because the patients forcing themselves to specialize were developing what he called function atrophy. By overdeveloping one psychological function to meet society's expectations, they were starving the others. The natural scientists who suppressed their artistic impulse became rigid and disconnected from feeling. The artists who abandoned their analytical interests became ungrounded and chaotic. The business person who killed their philosophical curiosity became efficient but hollow. These patients weren't failing because they had too many interests. They were failing because they had been convinced to abandon the very pattern of development their psyche required to become whole. The shame of being scattered had led them to amputate parts of themselves. And the amputated parts didn't disappear. They went into the shadow where they created depression, anxiety, restlessness, and a persistent feeling that something essential was missing from their lives. Jung's intervention was radical for his time. He told these patients to stop fighting their nature, to stop trying to specialize, to stop treating their breadth of interest as a problem to solve. Instead, he encouraged them to pursue their multiple interests deliberately and consciously, but with one crucial difference from how they'd been doing it. The difference was integration. Most multi-interested people pursued each interest in isolation. The music existed in one compartment, the science in another, the writing in a third. They experienced themselves as fragmented, multiple incomplete selves rather than one whole self with many dimensions. Jung taught them to look for the connections between their interests, to ask not, "Which one should I choose?" but "What pattern connects all of these?" When patients began mapping their interests, something remarkable emerged. The connections weren't random. A patient interested in music, mathematics, and architecture discovered that all three were expressions of their deep fascination with pattern and structure. A patient drawn to psychology, fiction writing, and philosophy realized all three were explorations of the same question: what does it mean to be human? A patient pursuing biology painting, and cooking, recognized that all three were expressions of their relationship with organic transformation. Jung called this finding the thread. Every multi-interested person had an underlying theme, a core fascination that expressed itself through multiple domains. The interests weren't scattered. They were different facets of the same diamond. And once patients could see the diamond instead of just the facets, their shame dissolved. They weren't unfocused. They were focused on something so large that it required multiple domains to explore fully. This discovery transformed Jung's understanding of psychological development. He began to see that specialization was one legitimate path to wholeness, but not the only path. Breadth was equally valid, equally powerful, and in some ways more complete, because it developed the entire psyche rather than just one function. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Now, here's where Jung's framework meets the M-shaped future, and everything clicks into place. The term M-shape describes a competency profile where a person has multiple peaks of deep skill, connected by a broad base of general knowledge. Picture the letter M, 2 or 3 peaks rising from a wide foundation. This is the opposite of the T-shaped model that dominated the 20th century, where you had one peak of deep expertise and a shallow breadth of general knowledge. The T-shaped model worked in a world where industries were stable, knowledge was siloed, and careers lasted decades within one field. But that world is collapsing. Industries are converging. The most valuable innovations happen at the intersection of fields. Artificial intelligence is replacing specialized knowledge work, and the people who thrive in this new landscape are exactly the ones Jung described. People with multiple peaks of competence connected by the ability to see patterns across domains. Jung couldn't have predicted the economic shifts, but he understood the psychological architecture perfectly. He knew that multi-interested people possessed something specialists lacked, what he called cross-domain intuition, the ability to perceive connections between apparently unrelated fields, to bring insights from music into their understanding of mathematics, to apply principles from biology to their approach to business, to see structural similarities between cooking and chemistry, storytelling and therapy, architecture and software design. This cross-domain intuition is the most valuable cognitive ability in the emerging landscape, because specialists can only see within their domain. They solve problems using the tools and frameworks of their field. But the problems the world is facing now, climate change, artificial intelligence integration, healthcare transformation, education redesign, don't live within single domains. They exist at intersections. And only people who can think across domains can see the solutions that specialists miss. Jung observed this capacity in his multi-interested patients decades before the business world caught on. He watched patients who'd been shamed for their breadth suddenly become the most creative, adaptive, and insightful people in any room, not because they had finally specialized, but because they'd stopped apologizing for their nature and started using it deliberately. But Jung also identified a critical challenge that multi-interested people face even when they stop shaming themselves. He called it the depth threshold. Having many interests is only powerful if you develop genuine competence in multiple areas, not just surface familiarity. The difference between a dilettante and someone with an M-shaped profile is depth. The dilettante samples everything and masters nothing. The M-shaped person develops real skill in several areas while maintaining broad curiosity across many. Jung found that multi-interested people needed to learn a different relationship with mastery than specialists had. Specialists pursue mastery as depth without end, going infinitely deep into one domain. Multi-interested people needed to pursue mastery as sufficiency, going deep enough in each domain to develop real competence, then allowing themselves to move to the next peak without guilt. This deep enough threshold varied by domain and purpose. You didn't need to become a concert pianist to integrate musical thinking into your cognitive toolkit. You needed to develop enough skill that you understood music from the inside, how it worked, what its principles were, how practitioners thought. That level of competence might take 2 years of serious study rather than 20. And that was legitimate. That was sufficient for integration. Jung taught his patients to think of their interests as an ecosystem rather than a competition. In an ecosystem, every element serves a function. Nothing is wasted. The music feeds the mathematics, feeds the writing, feeds the philosophy, and the whole system becomes more than the sum of its parts. But an ecosystem requires investment in each element. You can't just dabble. You need to develop each interest to the point where it genuinely contributes to the whole. This reframe liberated multi-interested people from the tyranny of choosing. They didn't have to pick one thing, but they did have to commit to developing real competence in their multiple areas. The freedom wasn't from effort. It was from artificial narrowing. They could work extremely hard across multiple domains instead of forcing all that energy into a single channel. Jung documented what happened when multi-interested patients embraced this approach instead of fighting their nature. The psychological changes were profound and consistent. The first thing that shifted was their relationship with identity. They stopped trying to define themselves by a single role or title. They developed what Jung called a meta-identity, a sense of self that transcended any single domain. They weren't a musician or a scientist or a writer. They were someone whose fundamental nature expressed through music and science and writing. This meta-identity was psychologically stronger than specialized identity because it couldn't be destroyed by losing any single domain. A specialist whose career collapses often experiences identity death. They don't know who they are without their expertise. But someone with a meta-identity could lose access to one domain and still maintain a coherent sense of self through the others. They were psychologically anti-fragile in a way specialists rarely achieved. The second shift Jung observed was in creative output. Multi-interested patients who stopped fighting their nature and started integrating their interests produced work that was genuinely original, not because they were more talented than specialists, but because they were combining elements that had never been combined before. Their music incorporated mathematical structures. Their writing was informed by biological principles. Their business strategies drew from philosophical frameworks. The work was novel because the combination of influences was unique. Jung recognized this as a form of what he called creative individuation, becoming so distinctly yourself that your output can't be replicated by anyone else. Specialists can be replaced by other specialists, but someone whose work integrates music, mathematics, and philosophy in a particular way is irreplaceable because no one else has that exact combination of developed interests. The third shift was in how these patients related to the world's chaos and complexity. Specialists often became overwhelmed when reality didn't conform to their domain's frameworks. The economist couldn't understand political dynamics. The psychologist couldn't grasp systems theory. The engineer couldn't navigate human emotion. Their expertise gave them deep but narrow vision. Multi-interested patients, however, developed what Jung called panoramic consciousness, the ability to perceive and navigate complexity because they had multiple frameworks for understanding it. This panoramic consciousness is exactly what the M-shaped future demands. The world is becoming more complex, more interconnected, more resistant to single-domain solutions. The people who can navigate this complexity aren't the deepest specialists. They're the broadest integrators, the ones who can see the whole board, while specialists are focused on their one square. But Jung was careful to warn against a trap that multi-interested people often fall into once they stop shaming themselves. He called it breadth without roots. The exhilaration of finally having permission to pursue multiple interests sometimes led people to scatter even further, adding more interests without deepening existing ones. They'd go wide without going deep enough anywhere, creating a flat line instead of the M-shape's peaks. Jung insisted that the power of multiple interests only activated when those interests were developed past a threshold of genuine competence. Below that threshold, you're a tourist in each domain, visiting but never truly understanding. Above it, you're a resident who can actually bring that domain's insights to bear on others. The discipline for multi-interested people wasn't narrowing their focus. It was ensuring sufficient depth across their breadth. He recommended what he called seasonal commitment. Rather than trying to develop all interests simultaneously, which diluted energy, multi-interested patients could focus intensely on one domain for a season while maintaining the others at a lower level, then shift primary focus to another domain. This cycling allowed for genuine depth development while honoring the need for variety. Each cycle deepened one peak of the M, while the broad base kept everything connected. Jung also addressed the social dimension of being multi-interested in a specialist world. These patients often felt they had no tribe. Specialists bonded with other specialists. Musicians connected with musicians. Scientists gathered with scientists. But multi-interested people didn't fully belong in any single community. They were always the musician who was also a scientist, the weird one who kept making connections no one else saw. Jung recognized this social displacement as painful, but potentially valuable. Multi-interested people became natural bridges between communities. They could translate between domains, facilitate collaboration, and see opportunities for connection that specialists within each field couldn't perceive. Their social displacement wasn't a bug, it was a feature. They were connectors in a world that desperately needed connection between its increasingly siloed domains. If you've spent your life feeling ashamed of your inability to pick one thing, Jung would tell you that the shame was never yours to carry. It was projected onto you by a world that didn't understand what it was looking at. Your mind doesn't scatter because it's broken. It expands because it's built for integration at a scale that specialists can't comprehend. Your restlessness when forced into one lane isn't a deficit of discipline. It's your psyche refusing to be diminished into a fraction of what it's designed to become. The M-shaped future isn't something you need to prepare for. It's something you've been preparing for your entire life without knowing it. Every interest you pursued, every skill you developed, every domain you explored, It was all building the architecture of a mind that the emerging world desperately needs, not despite its breadth, because of it. Jung's ultimate insight about multi-interested people was this: they weren't scattered versions of specialists. They were whole versions of something the world hadn't yet named. People whose psychological structure demanded integration across the full spectrum of human experience. People who couldn't be content developing one function because their psyche insisted on developing them all. People whose restlessness was actually the drive toward a completeness that specialization could never provide. You don't need to pick one thing. You need to develop many things to genuine depth and then trust that the connections between them will create something no specialist could ever build. That's what Jung saw in his multi-interested patients. That's what the M-shaped future rewards. And that's what you've been carrying inside you all along. Not a flaw to fix, but an architecture to fulfill. The world told you to narrow down. Jung would tell you to integrate up, to take every interest you've ever pursued, find the thread that connects them, develop each one past the threshold of genuine competence, and watch as the pattern reveals something that could only come from a mind built exactly like yours. Not scattered, not unfocused, panoramic, and the future belongs to you. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.